Um, I'll just say a few words of introduction, and then we'll move into the much more important presentations from the panelists, and then discussion. I'm sure that we all know that Bangladesh is actually now hosting the largest and most densely populated settlement camp in the world, and the UK is the second largest financial contributor to addressing the Rohingya crisis. And our strategy includes, obviously, substantive improvements of conditions in Rakhine in Myanmar to enable voluntary, safe and dignified return. I mean, that's the ultimate objective, of course, with regard to the Rohingya population. But obviously, at the moment, our work is also focusing very much on protection and the well-being of the refugees and host communities in Cox's Bazar and the wider region. This includes creating economic opportunities for the Rohingya and Bangladeshis living in Cox's Bazar to reduce poverty, dependency and criminality, and rehabilitating the environment, both in the camps and in the host communities, to reverse damage caused to forest, land and water resources by the presence of the camps. And obviously addressing energy and energy needs is a key part of this approach. Now, we're very happy that there's been a huge switch from over the last year or so from biomass or particularly wood for cooking and so on to LPG, to liquefied petroleum gas for much energy use within the camps. And of course, that's also helped with reforestation efforts. And our work at FCDO has supported this work through the Safe Plus approach, safe being safe approaches to fuel and energy plus landscape restoration and livelihoods. So that's why I have the honor of chairing this forum. But although the focus is on the Rohingya camps, but I hope much of what we discuss and learn about today will be applicable not just to other refugee camps, but to other informal areas of settlement or areas of temporary population. So we're going to have 4 presentations. The first one is going to set the scene around particularly around the how the Rohingya camps arose and what has been done there. Then we'll have 3 further presentations which will focus in on different aspects of the energy equation, including looking at architectural design. So we've got some really interesting discussions to come. After each presentation, we can have a few minutes for any points of clarification, but let's leave the general discussion until we've heard all the presenters, because I think we'll find that in total that will lead to some really interesting ideas. And then right at the end, I'll ask Sebastian Groh, who's the founder and CEO of SOLshare, who've organized this session, to make some closing remarks. There are also some various other housekeeping issues that have been put into the chat bar, including using headphones if you can. Unfortunately, I don't have headphones, so can't do that. But and then to put your comments and questions into the chat bar, and we'll decide whether we can, manage the discussion through the chat bar or whether we can open up to people raising questions verbally as well. We'll decide that as we move into discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who's Samira Siddique, who's a National Science Foundation doctoral researcher in energy and research at University of California in Berkeley. Her work is on global climate change justice. And she has done a lot of work on the development of the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. She's going to, as I say, she's going to provide an overview and findings from ongoing research on the politics of aid and the development of the Rohingya refugee camps. Over to you, Samira.
Thank you, John. Let me just share my screen. Is that, whoops, is that working?
Yep, that's fine. Thanks. We can see it.
Great, thanks. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Gobeshona session today. As John mentioned, it's been a week of great learning about local climate change adaptation from all these different lenses. My name is Samira Siddique. I'm a PhD candidate in energy and resources at UC Berkeley, and I'm just really excited to be in conversation with my fellow panelists on this really important topic of energy resilience in the Rohingya refugee camps. So since this conference is focused on climate change adaptation, I want to use my time today to demonstrate how our pursuit of energy resilience in the Rohingya camps fits into a broader global narrative on climate change justice, particularly for displaced populations like the Rohingya and other migrant and refugee groups. So just please feel free to type in questions into the chat throughout this talk, and I'll hopefully be able to address them afterward. So first, let me just define what I mean by climate change justice. Climate change justice is an exciting area of research and activism that seeks to completely reform political, economic, and social systems that are inherently exclusionary. It's a global movement that acknowledges that climate change has very different social, economic, political, and health impacts on underprivileged populations. It's deeply rooted in history and in recognizing past harms, particularly in global colonial histories. And this is particularly relevant for climate vulnerable countries like Bangladesh in the global south that have been disproportionately bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change caused by countries in the global north. And in my research, I apply climate change justice to understand how we might expand our human rights and development frameworks to include displaced populations like the Rohingya. And one way that I like to start explaining the essence of climate justice is through these next few world maps that I'll show. So first, we see here the maps that are publicly distributed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that projects changes in global temperatures and average precipitation under our business as usual emission scenario. This map essentially tells the classic climate change story of really these global effects on temperature change, drought, precipitation, no matter where you are in the world. Now, this next map is a typical political world map. It suggests that our nation state borders essentially delimit certain things like climate change. That does not, and essentially things like trade, laws, diseases, disasters, and people, most importantly, are neatly contained within countries and nation state borders. But of course, we know that this isn't true, especially more so now with the COVID pandemic. And when we stick too strongly to what this map entails, we get this next map. And here we see that the global displacement of people all over the world is caused primarily by political conflict or environmental disasters. Currently, there are over 70 million displaced people either within their countries or as refugees and migrants who have crossed borders. And we're also seeing countries around the world are increasingly closing their borders to refugees, and that displacements are increasingly becoming protracted ones, as in refugee camps that last for decades. On average, I believe the refugee camp lasts for about 27 years. And this is really the jumping off point for where my own research begins in thinking about equitable ways to include displaced populations in our climate resilience and development planning. So I've been doing climate change and development research in Bangladesh for several years. And as many of you know, clearly you're attending this conference, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. About a third of the country gets deeply flooded every year during monsoon season, and much of the low-lying landmass produces hundreds of thousands of climate migrants every year. And in terms of global climate justice, Bangladesh is one of the countries of the global south that is disproportionately affected by the climate inaction of the global north. And in 2017, Bangladesh's climate story got much more complicated when the Rohingya refugee crisis began. And John already provided a brief introduction to the Rohingya crisis, but I'll just give a very brief overview of the crisis itself. So, the Rohingya are an ethnic minority that have lived in Myanmar for centuries, but have been persecuted for several decades. And in the fall of 2017, several of their villages on the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar were burned by the Burmese military, which caused a mass exodus of nearly 1 million Rohingya into Bangladesh. And their refugee camps are essentially the largest in the world. I believe they've been recently surpassed, but they're up there. And the refugee camps are in an area that is prone to flooding and mudslides during the monsoon season. It's highlighted over here. Um, in many ways, the services and infrastructure that were built in the Rohingya camps have benefited from the development and climate adaptation work that have been happening in Bangladesh for the past few decades. But there are key limitations in the equity of these processes and the implementation of these projects because of the Rohingya stateless status. And one way in which equitable planning is limited for refugee populations is through our traditional development paradigms. Many of you are probably familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are essentially a global guiding principle for nations on long term sustainability planning. They're a set of 17 goals that countries can use to address the social needs of their citizens, including education and health and sustainable community planning. And they're often brought up in the context of addressing climate change resilience. And in the practice of development, the participation and capacity building of communities is considered to be the ideal practice, as is the appropriateness of the development projects that are taking place. However, in a refugee camp, like in the Rohingya camps, refugees are not often actively involved on a systemic level in the projects that are implemented there, and thus participation, capacity building, and the appropriateness of of the project are not necessarily systemically achieved. So, a big question that I explore through much of my work is what does development even mean for stateless populations like the Rohingya? And how can climate justice actually be achieved for displaced populations with this limitation in mind? And I highlight SDG 7 here because this goal is to achieve affordable and clean energy for all and is most relevant to what my fellow panelists will probably address later on. Energy services are arguably the lifeblood of the Sustainable Development Goals because they are essential to achieving so many of the other basic services listed there. And particularly in a refugee camp setting, energy services are essential for hospital services, household lighting and cooking, internet access, businesses, and street lighting. Again, my fellow panelists will probably speak more to the implementation of the energy services, but I just want to highlight here that we really can't talk about longer term basic livelihoods for refugees without energy resilience. And more broadly, we can't talk about longer term climate justice without addressing the most basic needs and rights of these populations. And the Rohingya camps are an incredibly interesting case for understanding energy access and resilience. I would argue that it's one of the first refugee camp situations where there has been an explicit effort by aid and development organizations to address energy access, development, and environmental concerns earlier on. And unlike in past refugee camp situations, there is more of an effort between humanitarian organizations and development organizations to really work together to provide aid and services for the Rohingya. For example, there's been more investment in energy infrastructure through organizations like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank into technologies like solar lights and mini grids into the refugee camp. Whereas historically in refugee camps around the world, there really hasn't been much focused investment in energy. So they've usually ended up with energy supply that is dependent on diesel and charcoal, which are obviously not the most climate friendly. And since 2017, it's become clear that the Rohingya will likely stay in Bangladesh for many years to come. So there have been these informal calls for longer term development planning in the camps, which I note is challenging given that refugees are not systemically part of the planning processes and lack the formal state recognition and citizenship. And more recently, John also mentioned this, there has been more attention on the Rohingya camps needing to be more climate resilient with things like more shelter retrofits and reforestation. But at the same time, I'm sure many of you are familiar, there's the fact that a few hundred Rohingya currently reside in Pashamjar, which is a silt island off the coast of Bangladesh, a region where many climate migrants come from. So even as there are more climate-friendly initiatives taking place, we also see that there are deeper climate justice and human rights recognitions more broadly that are still not met. So I'll leave my presentation here and open it up for questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to engaging more with my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Samira. That was a really great introduction. I'm kind of going to abuse my power as the facilitator, because I did say that questions should be really about, after each presentation, should be just clarifications. But I can't help asking something which I think is broader than a clarification. I think it's really interesting, and I agree with you that there has been more of an explicit effort by everybody concerned to address the energy and environmental issues in the Rohingya camps and surrounding community more than in other somewhat similar refugee situations. Why do you think that is? Has it been because we kind of resigned to the fact that this is a long-term problem, which of course is, sort of not the way we want it anyway, or has there been another fundamental reason?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's a question I've really been tracing historically, looking a lot at the environmental history and climate adaptation that has taken place in Bangladesh and in South Asia more broadly. But I think that the aid and development organizations have really teamed up, particularly for the Rohingya case, as you mentioned, because they know it's so clear that refugee camps last for decades now, like that's an objective truth. But I think the Rohingya being based in Bangladesh in a way benefit from the climate adaptation and development that has been happening in Bangladesh for decades. And there already is this apparatus of the development industry in Bangladesh that has really lent itself to what's happening in the Rohingya camps. A lot of the same organizations that have been working in development, like BRAC, for example, have really taken over the camps in a lot of ways. I think there are probably more development organizations based in the camps than purely humanitarian ones, which also sets it apart from other refugee camp situations.
Yeah, okay. I think this is something that we can return to in the broader discussion, because it is a really interesting point, especially this point that, because of Bangladesh's sort of climate vulnerability, that might have changed our thinking. There's another question in the chat bar, which, yeah, let's respond to it. Can you see it, Samira? Are there any HDI focused in the study? Other comparable similar settlement and endangered 1/3 of Bangladesh?
What does HDI stand for?
Human Development Index, I think. Sorry, I'm just trying to read the question myself again, and I've lost it now.
Any other comparable similar settlements in the endangered 1/3 of Bangladesh? That is a great question. So it's interesting because in framing the Rohingya situation as a climate justice one, I would be remiss not to mention that so much of Bangladesh, I mean, the Bangladesh story is a climate justice story. And, you know, there are Rohingya living in Bhasanchar right now, but there are thousands of Bangladeshis who live on similar islands that don't get much attention at all. And so I wouldn't say there are other informal refugee settlements, uh, but there are plenty of Bangladeshi climate migrant communities that are based in that similar area. Not to mention the indigenous populations that live in Chittagong and, you know.
Yeah, that's what I said at the start, that I hope that this presentation will obviously, it will be centered on the Rohingya and the surrounding communities, but a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think, will be relevant to, you know, to our communities and to other communities who are living in very sort of vulnerable environments within Bangladesh. And then there's a question about how was sanitation managed. I suspect that, I'm not sure you'll know about that, Samira, but any comments on the sanitation and wash situation within the camps?
Yeah, so I think I'll answer that in a roundabout way to relate it back to energy for the purpose of this panel. But I think it's interesting in humanitarian situations that WASH is usually the first sector that is addressed because it is considered to be so essential to the basic needs of humanitarian displaced populations. And so I believe in this situation with the Rohingya, it was several different NGOs were commissioned by IOM and UNHCR to set up, you know, water pumps and health clinics and washing stations and latrines all over. And at least the first few months in the humanitarian phase, it wasn't very coordinated. But since then, I mean, it's been about 3 years at this point. It's pretty well organized. But compared to energy, at least, it always gets taken care of much faster. Whereas I think the energy projects weren't really planned to be implemented until early 2019. So that's a key difference between the sectors. I hope that answers something.
No, that's great. Thanks, Samira. So look, let's move on to the next presentation, but obviously we shall come back to you when we have the discussion in the round. So, thanks. So I think we're now going to go to Salma Islam, who's a project manager at SOLshare, who, as I mentioned, have actually organized this session. SOLshare, well, you'll hear more from the CEO, but is a startup company that focuses on solar solutions for on and off grid situations within Bangladesh. And Salma looks after SOLshare's project. She's a project manager, and that includes looking after SOLshare's projects within the Rohingya camps, as well as obviously SOLshare's broader fundraising portfolio, marketing and communications. So Salma, over to you.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, John. Good morning to everyone. Well, good afternoon and good evening, since I don't know who's coming in from what time zone. I'm just going to quickly pop open my screen. All right, there we go. Yeah. All right, so I will basically be talking a little bit about SOLshare's work in the Rohingya refugee camps, what we've done and what it is that we do. And I'd like to thank ECAT and Gobeshona for organizing this conference. It's a fantastic opportunity bringing everyone together, and we have a really interesting discussion ahead of us. So a little bit about what SOLshare does and what our solution is. So our solution is mainly peer-to-peer solar microgrids. We call this the Sol Bazaar, and it consists of several different IoT devices which are interconnected to form this peer-to-peer solar microgrid. We have a little GIF on the side showing you how the grid interconnects households with solar home systems, so existing infrastructure. For the background, one of the things that you should know about Bangladesh is that we have the largest deployment of standalone solar home systems across the country, nearly 6 million systems. And what SOLshare has done has found a way to make the system more efficient. So by interconnecting households that have solar home systems and households without solar home systems, what this does is creates a platform that allows these houses to exchange their electricity. So if I'm a solar home system owner, I can sell my excess solar energy to my neighbor. And as we interconnect more of these households together, it becomes a stronger and more powerful platform, allowing for more productive energy use. And what the platform consists of, if you see here, so what we have is the solar home systems which are interconnected with this device, the Sol Box, which is an IoT smart bidirectional meter. This is what allows our users to buy and sell electricity. We have the Sol Web, which is the dashboard. So we have Wi-Fi towers in each and every single one of our grids. And what this does is takes the data from our Sol boxes and sends it back to our head office here in Dhaka. And that's how we can see energy usage and consumption data. We also have our customer support, as well as the Sol app, which is an Android application, which allows us to not only register all of our users, but also design our grids in terms of GPS locations, and that helps us decide what the grid will actually look like. So a little bit about the impacts that our grids have had. Till date, right now, we have 36 solar peer-to-peer microgrids across the country. Some of the impacts that we have is that we're currently serving over 5,000 beneficiaries. 40% of them are women and children. We've reduced over 50,000 kilograms of carbon emissions. And by selling excess energy, our customers have earned over $18,000 till date. So this is just some of the impacts that can be had through access to energy, well, access to peer-to-peer energy, because our solution actually to earn a real income direct. The question is, why do refugees really need energy? Well, first of all, it is a basic human right. It is something that everyone should have access to. And especially for vulnerable and displaced communities, why this is absolutely key is that for the men who are displaced, they're able to adjust more quickly to a new environment and get acquainted with a new life. But for women and children, energy is the final key to helping them rebuild their lives in terms of work, in terms of education. So it is an absolutely essential element for them to rebuild their lives. And the last thing is that this actually paves the way for refugees to move from their reliance on aid to resilience and to becoming independent and feeling a real ownership and an ownership and feeling like they belong and they're a part of the community that they're in. So a little bit about the work that we have done in the Rohingya refugee camps. One of our past projects was a LATRINE illumination project, in which SOLshare basically illuminated some of the latrines in the Rohingya refugee camps using solar energy. So what we did was we installed solar home systems to power the lights in the latrines. And we did this, if you see the images, what we did was we installed lights in the latrines with remote sensors so that there was no switches required. And this was part of a push to increase safety for women to go to the latrines at night. So this was a successfully implemented project. But one of the issues that we have within the camps is that theft is very, very predominant. And that has been one of the issues that we've seen so far that has caused some problems. And one of the projects that we are working on now, which is really exciting, is piloting solar peer-to-peer microgrids within the camps. So under this project, what we'll be doing is piloting 2 solar peer-to-peer microgrids in the Bari region of the Rohingya refugee camps. We'll be assembling one grid within the refugees and one within the host community. And the reason why this is so interesting is because within Bangladesh, there are very strict regulations for assembling grids within the camps. So for the Rohingya refugees, this will be based on a cashless system, which is very different. I mean, normally our platform is actually integrated with mobile money, which means that you can easily top up your box with the energy that you would like to use for a month. But for the refugees, this means a completely different kind of a system. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And something that we've already done is conducted surveys within the camps. And it was very, very interesting because amongst the 308 households that we surveyed in the camps, we found that the demographic profiles were very, very similar. The differences were in education. So in terms of school-going children, it was less than 40% among our refugees, whereas over 75% for the host community, and the household income. So for the Rohingya refugees, again, because they are not allowed to have money, it's interesting to see that their household income for the month is obviously less than even 1,000 taka, whereas for the host community, it was over 9,000 taka. So there's a huge disparity there. And lastly, why is SOLshare solution important and why it could actually pave the way to energizing the camps? Well, for one thing, the solution is completely decentralized, which means that it can be assembled really quickly, as well as taken down and moved in case of, I mean, as we've all know that several of the refugees will be moved to Bashunchor. There's a target to have approximately 100,000 moved by the end of next year. So this is actually a very suitable solution, as this is a solution that can be moved easily. The other thing is that this creates ownership for the refugees themselves. By providing them with their own systems, it gives them a sense of ownership. And lastly, this is far, far more cost effective than putting mini grids throughout the camps. So it's a simple solution, it's easy to monitor, and you know, we could electrify all the camps for far, far less of a cost than using any other mini grid technology. So thank you all very much. And thank you.
Thank you, Salma. We have a question in the chat bar, which I think is for clarification. Are people able to use this solar energy without any help? So I think that's a sort of, you've touched on it, but it's a reflection of how, you know, how much technical assistance do you actually have to provide to people to use the energy once you've installed, I would guess. And then thanks for using the Internet of Things. I'm not quite sure what that refers to, but maybe you want to comment on that.
Oh, yeah, no, yes, people are able to use the technology without help. So initially, prior to even installing, we have to onboard these communities. And one of the things that goes into that is providing end user training. So depending on the community members that want the technology, obviously we're providing training to all of our end users as to how these systems need to be used. The other thing that we also have is that we have area managers within each of our grid, and they provide technical assistance and support to the communities. And we also have a 24-hour customer hotline. So we actually have the things in place to provide our users with the support and help that they need all the time.
Great. And then there's another question, which I think is, directly for clarification around, with the peer-to-peer grid system in the camp being cashless, what are the incentives to buy and sell if there's no direct monetary equivalent, and what are the principles of sharing electricity?
So basically, this is something that we are still working on, but instead of money, so the incentives would be in the form of goods. So whether this would be in the form of food or in the form of, goods that the refugees require. So that would be the mode of exchange. They would still be able to see how much they are earning in terms of their energy exchange. So what they're buying and selling, but the cash out, which someone earns from selling their excess energy, instead of actually being able to have cash, they would exchange that value for goods. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that does. That's very clear. And let me ask one. I can't resist asking. You said that
Sure.
theft is a real problem within the camps. So, and I don't know whether that was just for the lights in latrines or whether it applies to all your work. But what can you do about that? Because that clearly is an issue. Yeah,
it is, and one of the lessons that we've learned out of that is that definitely there is more monitoring required. But the other thing that we know, that what we understand for the peer-to-peer grid, is that because these are systems that will be provided to the refugees, there is a real sense of ownership there. And for someone who has that ownership, that, okay, this system belongs to me, this soul box belongs to me, I'm going to do what I can to protect, it's mine. So I will do what I can to protect that. But because, again, these soul boxes, as we mentioned, they're IoT devices. So these are something that we can see in real time on our dashboard. So there will definitely be more close monitoring of these devices. So hopefully that will prevent much of the theft. Yeah, so that's one of our lessons, is that there is definitely more close monitoring required.
Yeah, well, look, I assumed or thought that kind of building up a sense of community ownership would be part of the solution. So are you seeing incidences of theft going down, or is it still, a serious problem?
It's still a problem, of course, but I think we'll know more once our grids are up and we're monitoring them. We'll definitely have more information to share.
Okay, good.
Continue.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sal. I think in the interest of time, we should move on, although I noticed that that Sebastian has also just added a comment that with the entire camp being officially cashless, we're also doing a lot with tokens. So an electricity token will be the next logical step in this work, which certainly makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to Fawaz. Fawaz Rob, who's the founder and chief architect at Bangla Bari, which has a very strong emphasis. It's an architectural firm with a strong emphasis on sustainable infrastructure in rural Bangladesh. I also understand includes some plans or some work on Bhashan Char as well. But Fawaz, over to you.
Okay, hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine, thank you, and see you, very good.
All right, great. So I will just go ahead because we have very short time. So can you guys see the screen? If you can please.
Yes, can see the screen. We have another 3/4 of an hour. So yeah, about 10 minutes or so for your presentation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, actually, I'm Fawaz Rob. I'm the assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at North South University, and I have a firm called Bangla Bari Limited. We think of new ways of construction, different places, including the villages and Rohingya camps. First question we start with is design necessary? I always say in my presentation that it's a colonial mentality that sometimes we architects and engineers think that we have a better understanding of what people want just because they're economically in a lower echelon. So we try to impose our designs on this. If we look at in Bangladesh, if the intellectual intervention is necessary, we actually see that it's actually not doing so great because of the CI sheet, infiltration of CI sheet, the brick clean, child labor, timber. So there is actually, it's unequivocal among the academics that actually the intellectual intervention is necessary at points. Because when you get rid of this understanding of vernacular architecture, then it becomes very vulnerable to weather, and this and it just doesn't become a very good architecture at the end. I will take you directly. This is a picture of a satellite picture of Bhashan refugee camp, and you can see this is a vast amount. This is literally kilometers after kilometers of oceans that are just silt made this Bhashan Char. And this is the Rohingya refugee camp, as you can see, that has been artificially constructed with a berry bed around the camp so that the water doesn't go up. So this is one of the most exclusive, I would say, like scientific experiment that has ever been done on the basis of like Rohingya refugees or any refugees for that matter. So only time will tell that if this experiment becomes true. But unfortunately, it is being done on like real lives, and this was the idea that has been cashed out without much resistance from academics. And we have raised our concern several times that if it's sustainable. But anyways, this is what they have built. This is built by the armies, and not a single architect probably was involved in this. This was mostly done by the engineers and army engineers, and they have provided with the most efficient way of building things in a camp, which as an architect, I completely disagree with it, because this is a very awful way of building places. If you see very closely, you can see that this is almost like an interim camp where they would be settled without understanding like exactly where they are. You could be at any of the points and you would think that it's the same. And in between, they just punctured some schools and police stations. So it's a very unsustainable way of doing architecture. Now, like for example, this is a picture, I took it from the internet, but this is a picture where in the rural areas of Chittagong, they have built it. This is a housing, and it's a almost no cost housing. It's the most sustainable housing. And then right now, the government is also giving away, you can see in the yesterday's newspaper that they have published that thousands of houses are being given away to the homeless people, which is a good initiative. At its heart, it's a good initiative, but the road to hell is paved with good intention, because look, this looks like this, giving away houses of this. And there is a problem to that. I mean, you don't have to be an architect to understand that this is a very unsustainable way of making houses like this. And as we talk about energy resilience, like if the attention is not given to the basics of architecture, then it will always use more energy. It will be energy inefficient, and you know, the grid systems will fall apart. The reason it looks very bad on this picture and it looks much like just beautiful on this picture is because of the two major reasons. One is the sense of ownership, and secondly, using the indigenous materials that is available over there. This is over here, there's nothing indigenous, and there's no sense of ownership or community over here. This is just built, and there's a sense of almost prison. Now we asked, like, is there any good housing projects around? For example, one thing comes to mind. This is by Alexander Aravena. So what he did is, this is actually not a no-cost Rohingya refugee house. This was much more of a low-cost housing. So what his understanding was, okay, why don't we build this half of it and leave it for the residents to build the other half? And later on, in few years, organically it has changed into this. So the people have realized like how they want to create their spaces. For example, this, another low-cost housing that he did, and then later on the residents, they decided to do this. The reason it's so important to do something like this is because if people have sense of ownership, as Salma was saying, then they would be much more interested in making their own ways of doing things, their own spaces, and you don't need an architect or an engineer to dictate what theirs is. What we propose in our core, in our business in Bangla Bari, is to create CEB houses. It's a compressed earth block houses. One of the reasons, I will not bore you with the technicality, if you just look at the left, the earthen buildings remains always in the comfort zone, whereas concrete buildings always, especially for a country like Bangladesh. And if it's a CI sheet, like tin houses, then it's during the summer, it's very hot, during the winter, it's very cold. It's a most unsustainable way of doing this. And even if you put in lots of electricity in these houses and they're turning on their fans all day long, even then it will not cool them down. So we have to think of in the core system that how we can make it much more temperature resilient with a high insulation so that automatically these houses becomes comfortable. The compressed earth block is actually a CEB cement block that can be made with a small machine. And because of its thermal mass, the hot summer will evaporate and it will create a radiant cooling. So, and the reason we preferred this is because if you, instead of building them houses, if you give this machine and train these people how to build their houses, it will be much more organically, the housing will develop and they will know and they will do their things. So the infrastructure doesn't need to be made all the way. Halfway through, if you meet them, they will do it. Because I have to demonstrate, it's a small video, that how this machine actually makes. So here we go. Hello and welcome to another edition of Bangla Bari's video blog. Today we are going to be talking about how to make a compressed earth block, otherwise known as CEB. So now John will take over. Here you go, John.
Perfect cement mud block. You load the press, need a bit of sand on the bottom. In goes the mud, cement, sand mixture. A little bit more sand. Just lock it off. And press it down.
So as you can see that very easily the people, the villagers or the Rohingya camps, they would be, and we have proposed them several times, but you know, it was summarily rejected. But what we understand in our way of thinking is that it's much better to enable people to do their housing. That way they will make much more resilient housing, much more better housing. You just have to give them tools so that they can actually improve. And you know, there are cases like in Philippines, they have created very successful community build housings, which are very low cost. And then, you know, sometimes they had some design templates, but most of the time the design was and the landscaping was done by the people. And we have proven to build this, like this was a school that we built with the CEBs, and inside the children's were much better off. This was a school, children's school. And because of the thermal insulation, you don't necessarily need electricity all the time to keep people in much better condition. And we built the house made with earth, and it doesn't look so beautiful, but the fact is that this was done at a very cheap cost, where people were building it by themselves. So they were the ones who was giving the labors, and they knew where they needed their kitchen, where they knew where they needed their latrine. So they had better understanding of their space than us. Instead of going there and making the house as we want to do, we just enable them to make their houses. So yes, that change is possible. And I want to also, another thing I want to show you guys, if I have time. Do I still have time? Hello?
Yes, you do. Carry on.
Okay. So in Rohingya camp, when we were working, as you were asking, Samira, that what about the wash? So I will just play the video so you can actually get an idea.
To tackle the unprecedented influx of refugees, hundreds of single-pit latrines were constructed at the beginning. But now they are filling up and becoming almost unusable. And due to excessive plumbing, groundwater level is decreasing at an alarming...
Fawaz, your video isn't showing.
Oh, okay. Sorry, but it's over here. Can you see this video?
What we're seeing at the moment is your final slide. Change is possible.
Okay. Can you see it now? Okay. I will share the screen again. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so I will start from the...
To tackle the unprecedented influx of refugees, hundreds of single-pit latrines were constructed at the beginning. But now they are filling up and becoming almost unusable. And due to excessive plumbing, groundwater level is decreasing at an alarming speed. Because of the dense population in small area, lack of sanitation facility and water shortage can quickly turn into a critical problem. If unchecked, it can bring disastrous consequences for the inhabitants. Bangla Bari, an architectural and engineering firm, has two major proposals to fight these challenges. Number one, rapid sanitation through modular-based latrines. And number two, installing water purifiers with fingerprint system. The first proposal. Bangla Bari proposes a project of rapid sanitation where latrines can be installed cheaply and quickly. These latrines are double pit, made with recycled plastics and Lego-like in nature. To construct a traditional latrine usually requires 4 laborers, at least 2 to 3 days, and costs over 200 euros. Bangla Bari latrines can be built by just 2 persons in few hours, costing only 100 euro. Hence, these modular latrines can reduce both the cost and construction time by 50%. Moreover, it creates a great demand for recycled plastic, thus cleaning up the environment. The problem with the traditional latrine making is that it requires different materials to be purchased from different vendors. Brick, cement, heavy pit, latrine bowl, pipe, each element has to be bought from different places. So there is this huge system loss in transportation and construction. Also, 2 types of skill set is required. A mason to build the structure and a plumber to do the rest. Bangla Bari latrines eliminates all these problems. They're very simple to construct. Everything comes in a box, and since it is modular, it can be built quickly and, if needed, dismantled quickly. The color blue represents water and clean sanitation. In certain spots like the columns and bays, sand and mortar is filled to strengthen the structure. These latrines have huge benefits. Because they are double pit, the cleaning process is simple and it can be run perpetually for many years without much maintenance. Not only it is affordable and easy to make, these latrines are also very mobile. So if a family needs to move to a distant place, they can take these latrines with them. If something is broken, they just need to be replaced that small part instead of tearing down the whole thing. The brilliance of the design solves many challenges at once. Proposal.
I will actually stop here. I will stop my sharing over here. And so yes, right now actually in Bhashanchar, there is not much to be done. They have already built the houses, but what we are over there is working on the project proposal to make it much more, for the energy over there. So electricity is scarce. Right now they have built some of the solar panels there, and we are actually seeing that if it's possible to do some of the solar and wind hybrid things over there. And I was just there actually last month, and only 2,500 people have moved in, but they're expecting that almost 50,000 people will move in very soon. So that's why we are, Bangla Bari is actually, doing a partnership with SOLshare, so that the energy is well distributed over there and we can carry on. So this was my presentation. If anybody has a question, I would be very happy to answer. Thank you.
Fawaz, thank you so much. That was really stimulating. And as I said at the start, broadens it out from purely energy to looking at architecture, right. Architectural design. Look, two questions quickly.
Sure.
One chat bar and one's from me, but they're somewhat related. As with any technology, like something like the compressed earth block, which you just demonstrated, right. It seems so good. It begs the obvious question: why
right.
isn't it? Why is it not being, more widely adopted? Sorry, is it because it hasn't been tested, or it doesn't meet current engineering standards because the engineering standards have not been applied to these blocks, if you see what I mean? So I'm not saying they would fail the standards, right. but they just don't meet the standards. Or is it that, people are just unfamiliar with this technology? And then as I say, a related question in the chat bar is this innovative structural building, and can it cope with, is it a climate resilient technology? Right. In other words, cope with, some of the predicted impacts of the climate crisis? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. This is a very common question, so it's good. I am prepared for this question. The answer to this is that it's the major challenge is the mindset. It's not technical challenge. It's not our invention. So all over the world, it has been used in India, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, in Bolivia, and with much success actually. In a lot of places, wherever people has built with the compressed earth block, with cement stabilized compressed earth block, it has met with resounding success. Unfortunately, it does not replicate for few reasons. Number one is that it requires a machine and labor training to make this happen. And secondly, the major problem is people are not willing to change their mindset into something new that they haven't tested before. So for example, this housing, what we have made in Dinajpur, I forgot to show you guys the pictures. We have done a little housings like over there, and it slowly replicated when we made a organizational building. When we made a school, when people saw that it's good enough for school, they started doing it themselves. But there is no mass production of these blocks, so that's also a big challenge that people, even if they want to, they don't know how to get it happen. So but this is possible in the refugee camps where you have already from the donors, you can have the money, and then you can start this project right away, jumpstart this project, so that people can actually just come and take their bricks or make their bricks and go ahead and do it. And the second part of the things that you were asking, I think I lost the train of thoughts, that if this is a resilient, like climate resilient or not. It's actually much more climate resilient than what we have right now. Right now, the houses are built either with a CI sheet tin or with bricks. So this is much better. This provides much better insulation. And even though it's made with earth and cement, it's actually much better waterproof and the climate proof than regular 5-inch bricks. And secondly, for a very Bhashanchar, we were saying again and again, is because a brick which costs like 7 or 8 taka, by the time they brought it to Bhashanchar, it costed them, like it cost them about like 22 taka per brick. So the cost was highly inflated. Whereas if they built it with the cement and sand that they have over there, they only needed to bring the cement and they could have easily built this over there. Same goes with this Kutupalong and all these things. The problem here is not necessarily technical problem or technological problem. The problem is much more of a social and political problem. For example, they are not given, even in Kutupalong, when we tried to introduce this, we were told flat out that they are not permanent. So we don't want to create anything permanent. So they would not allow any permanent structure to be built. So here again, I emphasize that when we talk about this energy resilience and all this infrastructural development and everything, actually the question goes much farther back, that we have to first determine if they're here, how it's going to be governed, or who has the ownership. Because unless they have the ownership, everything is very unsustainable. Everything has an expiration date, and it will not move forward to a much better housing or much better anything for them. So that's my answer.
Fawaz, and you have a follow-up question directly related. So what do you suggest to overcome these socio-political barriers? I mean, presumably as a company, you are working on exactly that.
Well, that's a very big question, but we are just, the mysteries, like we are just the engineers and architects. We provide the solutions. It's actually, the question has to be answered much more by the government, who is actually in charge of how they're going to do and international relations. But what I suggest is, not just for this Rohingya camps, but for any kind of new housings, it's much better to start from giving ownership, even if it's an ownership for, let's say, 10 years. They say, okay, your ownership ends in 10 years or 5 years in a certain block, and then enable the population to decide what they're doing. It's time and again, as I was saying, this colonial mentality of designing anything for anyone is that instead of actually listening from them, we are always telling them what to do. It's like, for example, I would be much happier if someone from the Rohingyas came to this panel and said, listen, actually, we don't need all these things. We need this. So my understanding, and I was very fortunate to talk to many of these leaders. And again and again, they were saying that, like if we don't need all these things. If you give us lands to cultivate, if you give us places to build our own houses, we will do it ourselves. So I think enabling them, we have to think more about how to enable this population instead of providing them with lots of solutions. Thank you.
Oh, it's a great point to finish on, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. I mean, I think as development partners, we certainly recognise what you say, and I would suggest that we do listen to the Rohingyas, but yeah, the challenge is very pertinent, and yeah, it would have been great if we could have had a Rohingya representative here at this session.
Yeah.
So
just to finish off, if you guys want to know more, I just put it in my chat. My firm is called Bangla Bari, so banglabari.org, and you can get more information, and you can always ask me personal questions by email later on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Right, over to the last presentation, which is from Paul McCallion, who's the Senior Energy Officer at UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees here in Bangladesh. Paul's got a wealth of experience on energy intervention in the camps, including some of the points that I made at the start. So I think we'll go over to Paul to focus down on energy resilience again. And then after Paul's presentation, we'll have a broader discussion. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Yes, so as on the introduction, my name is Paul McCallion. I'm the Senior Energy Environment Officer with UNHCR. I've been based in Cox's Bazar for 2 years, coordinating on the energy environment front. So I'll just make a brief presentation. Before I do, I'll just explain that energy access issues for refugees, for the Rohingya refugees, obviously the big media presence in reality was that fuel got a lot of coverage and that's generally the norm. As a civilization, we use most of our energy from fuel. Fuel is the fuel and air conditioning would be our two big ones in the more developed world. So we generally approach energy access into two areas. One, which would be the electricity, which would be like a SOLshare home solar system, which would be solar panels and so forth for communal facilities, public lighting, and then fuel efficiency. So this presentation is more based on the context, based on like the global pattern, and then once the environment side of it is equally as important. But generally, if you've got the fuel right, then the environment, and then the electricity, the energy for access comes in. So on the first slide, I'm sorry, I'm just, so, yep. So on the first slide, we can see that the 71,000 target for a host community households, and the entire refugee camp is LPG, has got coverage of LPG. We're looking to introduce fuel efficiency, and that's through the pressure cooker. As many of you may be aware what the pressure cooker is, it just basically makes cooking a lot more efficient, uses a lot more fuel. What is interesting is within the host community, because they are buying their own fuel. It's a lot. The pilot shows that savings could be very significant to household incomes, between 30 and 50%. Then on the power side, we're moving into mini grids and micro grids, spread 40 at the moment, spread across UNHCR coverage areas. There's also IOM coverage areas. Conventional AC electrical works we also have to do, so that distribution points, registration centres, ICT centres, hospitals, police posts, and so forth. So we also need to take care of the normal standard wiring, the electrical AC wiring. M&E and data collection is hugely important, because how are you going to test pilots? How are you going to basically measure your impact to show to the government, to show to the organization that the interventions are successful? So all the pilots we do are measured, all the projects we do start at the pilot stage, where at the start you've got the M&E to measure, and then go into, dependent on the feedback, dependent on the changes that have to be done, then going into the full coverage area. We're doing a lot of these here tasks with IUCN and Schneider Electric. Then there's the solarization of the compound. We're looking into our operations, how we can add solar hybrids to them. The green box is a UN-wide initiative where they measure the energy consumption for mains grid electricity as it comes in, before obviously the feasibility, and they decide on being able to go solar. So we're at the green box stage where we're measuring our electricity consumption at the operational office level, which again goes towards any commitment that has been made towards host governments on the environmental side. So we reduce our carbon footprint that way as well. Peer-to-peers is the pilot that we're working on with SOLshare. We're viewing it from a social cohesion side, so refugees and host communities, and to help foster and cement relationships between them. Then solar streetlights. Solar streetlights would be the very traditional approach, as in from the protection point of view. UNHCR is a protection agency, so we have these in for nighttime safety and nighttime access. We're also in the process of setting up an innovation hub with Schneider Foundation, so Schneider Electric Foundation, and the Global Plan of Action, GPA. So this we are looking at e-cycling and e-waste and battery recycling. And then finally, given Bangladesh's location geographically, we're looking at the lightning arrest side. Lightning arrests between development banks have got some technologies. We've also got a framework agreement, but we want to copy the Vietnam, Thailand model, and we want to move away from this eventually, and moving on to palm trees, which they've done in Vietnam, Thailand, and which is now being studied for Bangladesh for the same reason by the government, for lightning protection. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So then, just to go a little bit into the pilots, the pressure cooker pre-pilot that we're doing at the moment, we started it off with host community members. With the host community members, we've trained up 30 of the host community members at the start, before the COVID lockdown. Then the trainers were distributed pressure cooker. Trainers were also trained up on a video. The video was language specific, and it taught 5 recipes, and also the do's and don'ts, cleaning, maintenance, and so forth. So the primary findings from what we've done so far, which is 357 households, including refugee and host community, is 35% fuel efficiency is what it's looking like, and a time saving per meal of 15 to 20 minutes per meal. And to date, any follow-up that we've done on our M&E points to 100% retention, 100% attention by the host community and refugees. So we're looking at, if we project that to overall costs across the camps and the host communities, it's looking like a savings of 2 million could be made. That includes host and refugee community. So then across the camps, again, it's not a pilot, it's a pre-pilot. So this is estimations of around 7 million in fuel savings. Next slide, please. Then moving on to the solarization of the camps and power and facilities. Relatively new intervention at the camps to be carried out by development actors. So basically we have the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank on board. There's a number of different sizes and different technologies. The one you see at the bottom is around 40 kilowatt peak, and the one you see at the top goes anywhere from around 3.6 to 5, depending on whether it's a mini grid, depending on whether it's a micro grid or a mini grid. On the UNHCR side, we're just going on the mini grid model, and that's on the bottom, and you see it's providing electricity for one of our 24/7 clinics. Given the Bangladeshi context, that the heavy cloud cover and the heavy monsoon season, we will always have a hybrid, a backup generator. So we've also got a generator there, and that's with our solar street lights. A lot of the camps, after about 3 days of heavy rain, the lights, the battery reserve is gone. So we've just based it on that. UNHCR is in collaboration with Electricity de France, and it was a High Commissioner's initiative to look at some job creation and energy. So that's where our entry point came in, and then we just started working with the host communities. Working with the development banks and working in the refugee camps. There is no permanency to any of these structures. These structures can all be taken down when the refugees either return home, or the camp area switches back to government, or whether it's national parks or whatever. So all these are semi-permanent structures. Next slide, please. So questions and answers, basically, and I hope that you've been able to understand my strong, my accent and what I've been saying. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. Thanks. That was very clear. I do actually have 2 points of clarification before we move into broader discussion. Firstly, could you just explain what you mean by lightning arrestor and palm trees? I think I can guess, but I'm not completely clear. And then secondly, on the pressure cookers, I mean, it seems like a real no-brainer, but often these interventions fail because of lack of cultural acceptance. But I noticed you had 100% retention of the pressure cookers, so presumably all the indications are that this is going to be a very successful. Well, I hesitate to use the word technology because it's such a widespread cooking technique using a pressure cooker. But I would imagine you're pretty hopeful about them, yeah? So sorry, two questions: lightning arresters and pressure cookers.
Yeah. So yes, and I suppose the lightning arresters I should have elaborated more on. So just geographically, where Bangladesh is, it sits in an area where there's a high, an area that's very prone to lightning strikes. Thailand and Vietnam looked at a model where they had the same problem, but Mother Nature's response to this is certain species of palm trees. These species of palm trees, grow very tall, very quickly, and straight up. So in about 8 to 10 years. A lightning arrestor there's lightning rods and lightning arresters. Lightning rods are what's on buildings, and they just basically take the lightning strike and send it to ground. Lightning arresters are designed to attract lightning. They take the lightning strike, they go straight to ground, and the theory is because they go straight to ground, they do not hit buildings or people. So lightning also causes landslides and kills people indirectly. So that's why we wanted to not always rely on, a human engineering design, but go from human engineering to Mother Nature. So we basically looked at the models that the Bangladesh government were starting to pilot, which was based on feedback from Vietnam and Thailand on the palm tree planting. So that's what I mean by lightning arresters. And then yes, the pressure cooker. So the pressure cooker has been about since 1671. So it's a well-established technology. It was just the evolution of steam power that allowed the pressure cooker to be utilized so well. What we've done is we visited the refugee camps in Nepal, and we studied how they were using LPG and pressure cookers, and they were making a 50% savings on fuel compared to what the average household here in the host community, on the refugee community, would be doing on pressure cookers. So we know then that cultural acceptance and adaptation and food culture is the key. So that's why we designed the recipe book. That's why we broke up the pre-pilot into 2 groups. We did training on the different recipes, training on how to use the pressure cooker with 200 people. Then we took the feedback because we spent a 6-week period of monitoring after that. Then we took the feedback and the gaps that were created, and then worked harder on how to make sure there were no gaps. And now we're just about to get all the data on the final 200. So the Nepal, it's very well used, the pressure cooker. India, it's very well used. Pakistan, is very well used. We're finding that here regionally, it's generally just used for most of the time, not all the time. Most of the time, it's used for tenderizing meat. So we're trying to get it as a development weapon with the development tool with the host community, and basically also it can be a very good fuel efficient technology within the camps. So far that's what we're finding, and we're working with IUCN and East West University for the final report on what the data analysis tells us. So that'll be coming through in the next couple of weeks. Over.
Excellent, thanks, Paul. So as I say, cultural factors may be an issue if there's not sort of widespread acceptance of using pressure cookers for the types of meals that the Rohingya communities are actually cooking. But hopefully, and by the sounds of it, this is something that could hopefully leap from pre-pilot to implementation and full-scale rollout quite quickly. And sorry, I have to ask, how on earth can a lightning strike cause a landslide? Oh.
Yes, no, that's a fair enough question. I suppose you need to picture in your head the when you're watching TV and you see a horror movie or a storm and there's a lightning strike and a branch of a tree is chopped down because it's struck by lightning. So what actually lightning will do is it'll hit the ground, go to the ground. It could be halfway up a slope. It could be at the top of a mountain. If the soil is in any way not any way unstable. So let's just say that there's not a tree, there's not lots of trees where the roots hold the soil into place. Then it can cause a landslide, and then you can have like maybe in the valley you can have animals, people, houses. So that's how lightning can cause a landslide. It's not direct, so that's called an indirect lightning strike. You know, like the indirect consequences are the lightning strike, but the indirect deaths are or damage is not directly the lightning strike. So that's how that happens. It's fairly common in this part of the world that people actually get directly hit by lightning. So it's just one of those things that we've had to learn as we move ahead.
Great, thanks. I'm clearer now. And then there's a question in the chat bar about what are the sources for accessing LPG? I'm guessing that means where does the LPG actually come from? And my understanding is that it's manufactured and refined within Bangladesh. But any comment on that? And then a second question on what challenges do refugees face in terms of power, when there is a cyclone or a massive storm, what happens to the power then?
Yeah, so basically, yes, all the LPG that we're getting comes comes from Chittagong. So all our suppliers have storage facilities in Chittagong. My understanding is that there's going to be storage facilities in Cox's. The different suppliers are going to build also storage facilities in Cox's in the nearby future. So most of the LPG is Chittagong, but yes, there's nothing that's so the companies and the suppliers would be Bangladesh companies and suppliers as per best practice. And the other question, yes, so basically when there is a cyclone or and so forth, basically in the camp with the refugees, it is exactly the same as the Bangladesh community. Wind goes up, cyclone gets heavy, there are power cuts, sometimes there's structural damage to buildings. So it's exactly the same in the camps as it would be in the host community in a heavy monsoon season or a heavy cyclone season. So power is always intermittent. And of course, charging of solar devices is also intermittent depending on the very heavy cloud cover that is experienced in Bangladesh. Over.
Okay, thank you so much. Look, I've done a terrible job of chairing in the sense that we're coming very close to the end of the session. But having said that, I don't see any further questions in the chat bar specifically. What I would like to ask, I'm going to ask one general question and then ask Sebastian to make any sort of closing reflections. But just the question I'm going to ask each of the presenters in turn is what they've heard today that has surprised them, or anything that they're going to take away and reflect upon. So I'll ask each presenter in a second. But just to remind, we've had a really fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. We started hearing about the kind of how development partners and others should be approaching refugee crises, and that there's a need to consider energy early on in the development of the crisis, particularly because refugee communities never turn out to be as temporary as is initially hoped. We heard about fascinating pilots in with regard to the use of mini grids and solar lighting in latrines, but some of the challenges from that. Then we had a much broader discussion around architectural challenges and the need to think in a far less rigid way and be much more consultative. And then we've just heard, I think, a really comprehensive issue of the many types of energy issue that we face in a situation like the Rohingya and the surrounding communities. Certainly more issues to consider than I had been aware of. So a really fascinating session. Can I just ask each person in turn, assuming that Samira is still there, because I believe you're in California at the moment, Samira, so presumably it's getting pretty late on a Saturday night, but any reflection on what you've heard, anything that surprised you?
Yeah, thanks so much. It was really great to hear from Fawaz, Salma, and Paul, I guess. It was pretty amazing to hear what each of you are working on, having worked on the Rohingya situation in my own research since the start of the crisis, just to see how far all this work has come from August to 2017. And in particular, just hearing more from you, Paul, about all these different initiatives that the UNHCR has been taking on the environment and on climate resilience planning, just compared to what was happening those first few months. I think definitely one thing that I'll take away from all of this is that the Rohingya case really is an experiment in so many ways. As Fawaz mentioned, it is so unique compared to other refugee situations around the world, because all these environmental and climate initiatives have been taking place really from the beginning of the crisis up till now, and it just keeps getting more and more complex, especially now with the Pashanchar architectural situation. I'm hopeful that other humanitarian and aid and development organizations around the world will be looking to the Rohingya situation to take away lessons on how to build out their capacity and climate and development planning more earlier on, like what happened in the Rohingya case. And I guess one thing that I would like to touch on that wasn't really talked about much in terms of the architectural and energy and environmental planning is that it's really important to also think about the governance and political economy behind a lot of this implementation. It's because all these techno-social fixes are amazing, but again, it is all an experiment, and there are real humans involved in these initiatives, and it's just as important to really think about how do we actually bring in these populations at every level to really be climate resilient on a social and political level on their own, and not just dependent on these different technologies. So I'll leave it at that and hope to talk more.
Thanks, Samira. It's a really good optimistic note to end on, and as well as the reminder of the importance of the political economy, which of course we recognise for all our interventions. But I picked up your challenge at the start of your presentation. So great that as a development partner, I can hear the optimism and the sense of progress that you've seen as well. Thank you, Salma. Over to you.
Salma, you're still on mute.
Salma, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I thought I'd unmuted myself. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters, to Samira, Fawaz, and Paul. It was very interesting to hear about Samira's research, as well as the work that Fawaz and Paul, UNHCR, has done in the Rohingya refugee camps. I think it's as Samira was saying, that it's not just an experiment, but the case of the Rohingya refugees is very unique for a lot of reasons. Because of the government restrictions that we have. I mean, initially there was no internet in the camps. There's no cash allowed in the camps. So for those reasons, I think the case is very, very unique in terms of what we implement and how we implement. And because of those things, we have to come up with even more innovative solutions to address the problems. And I think that's something that, I mean, there are a lot of lessons that are coming out of this and will continue to come out of the case of the Rohingya refugees. I mean, it's been wonderful to hear about sustainable housing from Fawaz, and also all of the work that UNHCR has done and continues to do within the refugee camps. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Salma. That's great. Fawaz?
Yes. Well, I was just in Bhashanchar last month. So in terms of surprise, I am maxed out, like it was, it's really, I was telling Samira, it's like going to Federico Fellini's movie. It's surreal. It's really, everything about it is very surreal. And you arrive there and it's very different from any kind of reality. What actually surprises me and pleasantly surprises me is that so many people and so many minds are actually working to make sure that these people who, the haves and the have-nots, that the divide reduces, and people are coming up with all these new technologies. And at the core of everything, I feel that these academics, the engineers, the architects, everyone has a good intention that how to make their lives better. Not just Rohingyas, but in general, like the housings. And these kind of sessions actually gives me hope that, there are a lot of other people who are thinking like me that, okay, what can I do to make these things better? So this pleasantly surprises me. And, I've been working with them for a while. I mean, I was in the earlier stage 3 years ago. We built, my firm, we built like 112 latrines, double pit latrines within a span of 3 months. And we have seen the worst case, like at the beginning when the influx was happening. And compared to that, right now, when we go to Kutupalong, and compared to that, it has improved a lot since then, the in general situations. But one thing that has not changed, and that always surprises me, is that all this discussion that we have over here, very small portion of it actually gets translated into execution at the final moment. Because somewhere along the line, all this understanding and the ideas of this, all this session, like these intellectual sessions that we have, they get lost because the people who are supposed to be listening to us, the government, the people who are in charge of that, for some reason, it gets lost. It gets lost in the translation, it gets lost in the way. And the final reflection is not there, because I know for a fact that a lot of architects, not just me, a lot of architects, engineers, they were all giving their 2 cents. They were designing, and there was a design competition in the universities on how to make this build. And by the time it got built, this camp in Bhashanchar, it's like they had taken all the things and they said, okay, what was the worst design possible? And they built it like that. So, like I would be much more happier to see that these kind of discussions, the minutes of all these things we are saying, gets to the government, gets translated, and goes all the way to the end. So that SOLshare's wonderful technology, I forgot his name, his technology, and our understanding, all these things, so that there's at least some part of it goes to the end. Thank you. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Fawaz. Look, yes. All I can assure you is that as development partners, we certainly hear what you're saying. I mean, I think part of the reason why it gets lost comes back to this political economy analysis and, some of the sort of incentives and disincentives that operate for and against the kind of interventions that we're talking about. But yeah, we haven't had time to discuss that in detail, but hear what you say. Thanks. Paul.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and so I have to apologize. It came a little bit late to the conversation, but what I do find impressive too, as a takeaway, is the fact that all panelists have spoke about the importance of sustainability and the importance of working with the community. So if you even take what we've been trying to do with fuel efficiency and to host in the refugee community, it's when you can engage both communities that things tend to be able to gain traction. So what I've taken away from this is just a reinforcement of the importance of that. Um, that whether you're looking at more sustainable buildings, whether you're looking at fuel efficiency, whether you're looking at providing general power, yes, unless you engage with a technology and a methodology that benefits everyone, then you're probably going to be pushing a rock up a mountain as opposed to watching the rock roll down the mountain. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Good point. And sorry, I'd forgotten that you were at a previous meeting, so I hadn't been able to join. I hope you can look at the recording of the session because there's some great presentations before you arrived. For me, in 4 words, I really liked the from reliance to resilience. I think that was either Samira or Salma who said that, but that's a great little phrase and sums up, really gets to the core of what we've been discussing today. I said I'd leave Sebastian for some fun. Sebastian is the CEO of SOLshare, and SOLshare helped pull together this event. So, Sebastian, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, John, for doing such an excellent job in moderating the session. And we're all still here. We're 10 minutes over, so it must have been to some extent intriguing. Well, thank you very much. And also thanks, of course, to ICAT and the colleagues. Fawaz, just given in response to your last comment, I mean, the colleagues of ICAT are here, Saqib is here. I'm sure we'll find a way to pass on the message. The recordings will be available so that this bears obviously more fruit than the internal group here, which has been discussing as well as attending the session. So that's the overarching goal. And lastly, just very briefly, I loved the statement from Samira. The Bangladesh story is a climate justice story. It also underlines the experience the country has in being resilient to shocks, and the experience also then to create things by themselves. And ownership, I think, was one of the takeaways here, is an incredible strong force for sustainability, and that ownership and innovation then can be a catalyst for development. Samira opened up the question: what does development mean for these informal settlements, for the stateless? And I love the simple. I mean, it cannot be more simple than the example that Fawaz gave. You build a house, half house is made, and half house is to be made, and then you leave it to the creativity of the people to create this other half. I think it's incredibly simple concept, but it probably has massively interesting insights and also nurtures the creativity and the ownership of the people. So I love that example, and I think it's kind of a metaphor for what we said, that sustainability can be nurtured through that. And maybe one thing, and building also on the initial notion by you, John, that whatever we discuss may have obviously implications for other camps, for other informal settlements. I mean, Paul said it, the first thing they did before implementing their project, they went to a camp in Nepal and saw, oh yeah, they're using those pressure cookers, they're using this LPG, they have these problems, but this works well. If you think about a camp that it is fairly homogeneous, especially if you're in the same South Asian continent, I'm sure that has been a driver for the learnings, and possibly also then has had an impact on the success UNHCR is having now with this project. So some incredible insights. So again, thank you very much, and also thank you for the audience for the endurance. And thanks all to the panelists. Thanks, Ikat, again. Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, Sebastian. Great wrap up there. Yes, I was also going to thank the audience. It hasn't been an endurance, I hope. But as you said, the great thing is that everybody has stayed, because it has been such a fascinating discussion. So look, I'm afraid we are overdue over time, but again, thank you to everybody. And we will, this session has been recorded. As you say, we will be bringing the key points to the attention of ICAD and others. And certainly as a development partner, we hear very much the messages that have been clearly conveyed today. So that's it. Thank you for an excellent session. Bye now.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.